In 1929, Joseph Stalin turned 50 years old. He was now portrayed as a secular god, as the savior of his people. The propaganda was relentless. It was Stalin who brought you the revolution, Stalin who gave you food, Stalin who saved the Soviet Union from the corruptions of the West.
It's very difficult to explain to the American people how much indoctrination and propaganda is all the time slammed on you. You're indoctrinated in something that when you are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, you start to believe it, that it's true.
School children were taught that Stalin was infallible. His ideas on philosophy, literature, and even genetics became state policy. The worship of Joseph Stalin was the new Soviet religion.
People saw his portraits everywhere. Every newspaper, every day had his portraits. He was really everywhere. And when people go to sleep, last name which they heard, it was Stalin.
If Stalin were to remain a god, he'd have to make sure no one threatened his rule. In 1934, Sergei Kirov was murdered, a man Stalin had handpicked to head the Leningrad Communist Party. Kirov had been very popular, a little too popular for Stalin. Some say he ordered the killing himself. He also began purging the educated classes. Thousands of writers, artists, and scientists, in fact, most of the intelligentsia, were tried and convicted as traitors. The sentence was death or the Gulag. And he almost eliminated his old enemy, the military elite. 57 out of 85 corps commanders disappeared, along with tens of thousands of lower-ranking officers. The officers signed confessions, but these documents were highly suspect.
The documents were produced a year or two ago. They all read, oh yes, I confess, it's a perfectly ordinary document, but they found that there were forensically verifiable bloodstains on the confession. And of course, torture was used on an enormous scale in the Stalin period.
No one was spared. Stalin even tried the heroes of the revolution, men that a generation of Russians had grown up revering. From 1936 to 38, the old Bolsheviks were convicted of ridiculous charges of espionage and counterterrorism. He even purged his old ally, Nikolai Bukharin.
Stalin needed a bizarre form of coronation as the great leader by making Lenin's closest friends and comrades confess to having been not real communists, not real patriots, not real Bolsheviks, but spies, assassins, wreckers. To force them to confess to these crimes was for Stalin the ultimate, or he hoped it would be, psychological fulfillment of this need to be the one and only embodiment of everything glorious in modern Russian and Soviet history. He needed these trials.
Stalin approved the death sentences of these men, even though he knew the confessions had been forced by torture. Trotsky, who was in exile in Mexico, was the only one who could speak out.
These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism. That is from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers. What will be
Stalin soon silenced him, too. In 1940, a Soviet agent attacked Trotsky with an ice pick. He died the next day. It wasn't just the famous who were liquidated. Anyone could turn you in on a trumped-up charge, a neighbor, a boss, even your children. Terror became an everyday emotion as millions just disappeared from sight.
Every evening, nobody knew what's going to happen to him. Because the individual means nothing. The individual is like a piece of sand in the big, big desert. You can run it over with a truck, you can step on it, you can crush it, it just means nothing.
Yet Comrade Stalin seemed to remain above the fray. He blamed the terror on an overzealous police force and would periodically purge the head of the secret police. And they weren't just killed, they were erased from all official memory.
I'll tell you, even my grandfather, who was the victim of Stalinist repressions, he was able to survive, and he did not complain about the Soviet power or even about Stalin. He thought that the local leaders, the local bosses were to blame.
It's a very strange situation, the role that Stalin played in the lives of people in the Soviet Union. At the same time that he was evil and terrifying, he was secretive enough about it that I'm not sure that people, until much later, associated what was actually happening with the person of Joseph Stalin.
But one person did. His wife, Nadezhda, had learned about the famine from students returning from the Ukraine. She and Stalin began arguing frequently. One night at a banquet at the Kremlin, Stalin started flicking cigarettes at her across the table. She stormed out of the room and was found dead of a gunshot wound to the head the next day.
What we don't know is whether she retreated to their apartment in the Kremlin and shot herself to death, or whether there was a fight and he killed her. We don't know. People who hate Stalin greatly in Russia believe he killed her. People who still find some reason to say positive things about Stalin believe she committed suicide, and after that, as they say, his heart turned to stone.
Nadezhda's death severed his last link to reality. He had seen enemies everywhere for so long that he could no longer recognize a real one. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was creating a society as inhuman and repressive as Stalin's Soviet Union. And while the Nazis and the communists professed to hate each other, in reality, a grudging admiration existed between their leaders.
Stalin personally admired Hitler, the way how he manipulated with the people, how he got convert millions of Germans. So he was sometimes even watching him and trying to use his experience. When, for example, in '34, Hitler eliminated the commander of the SA troops, Ernst Röhm. And when Stalin got to know about that, he told to his colleagues, he said, look at Hitler, what a bright guy, you know. He shows us how to deal with political opponents.
In 1938, Hitler took Austria. By March of 1939, all of Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Nazis. Stalin knew he had to ally with someone. He had earlier approached the West, but Germany seemed like a better bet. They could offer him territory, the Baltics and half of Poland, and peace, at least temporarily. So in August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler would soon betray his new ally and bring the Soviet Union to the brink of disaster.